diner for the dead. I was never the kind of person to take back roads, especially at night. But hunger and exhaustion make you do stupid things. I had been driving for hours, making my way home from a business trip that had dragged on too long. The main highway had been closed due to an accident, and my GPS rerouted me through a series of winding, unfamiliar roads. The gas station I had stopped at earlier was the last sign of civilization I had seen for miles. Then I saw it. A neon sign flickering in the dark. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. The old-fashioned diner sat just off the road, its large windows glowing with warm, yellow light. The parking lot was empty except for one rusted pickup truck. I was starving, and I figured a quick bite would be better than driving another hour on an empty stomach. As I pulled in, something felt off. The diner was too still, like it had been waiting for me. The neon light buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows across the lot. But my hunger pushed the unease aside. I stepped inside, and a bell above the door jingled. The place looked like it had been frozen in time. A classic 1950s diner, red booths, checkered floors, a long counter with spinning stools. The air smelled like coffee and grease, but something underneath it smelled stale. There were only a few people inside. A man in a suit sat hunched over a cup of coffee at the counter. A woman in a polka-dot dress stared out the window, unmoving. An elderly couple in a booth whispered to each other in low voices. And then there was the waitress. She stood behind the counter, dressed in a pale blue uniform, her blonde hair pinned back in tight curls. Her smile was too wide, her teeth just a little too white. "Welcome to Mel's," she said, her voice oddly melodic. "Take a seat anywhere you like, honey." I hesitated. Something about her eyes unnerved me, but I shook it off and slid into a booth near the back. She glided over, not walked, glided. "What's good here?" I asked, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. Her smile didn't falter. "Everything sugar, but I'd recommend the special." I glanced at the menu. There was no special listed. In fact, there were no prices, just words that seemed outdated. Meatloaf platter, Salisbury steak, egg cream soda. "Sure," I said. "I'll take the special and a coffee." Her eyes gleamed. "Good choice." She disappeared into the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. I glanced around. None of the other patrons had moved since I sat down. The man at the counter hadn't touched his coffee. The woman by the window hadn't blinked. The elderly couple whispered in a language I couldn't place. A chill crept over me. Something was very wrong. Then the jukebox crackled to life. A slow, warped version of Dream, A Little Dream of Me played. The singer's voice distorted, stretched, sent a shiver down my spine. The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress returned, carrying a steaming plate. She set it down in front of me. It looked normal, a burger and fries, but the meat was too red, almost raw. The fries were limp, soaked in something too dark to be grease. "Eat up," she said, her grin never wavering. I stared at the plate. The smell was wrong, too sweet, too metallic. I looked around again. The other patrons were all watching me now, silent, unblinking, waiting. My stomach twisted. I couldn't eat this. "Actually, You should eat," the waitress said, leaning in closer. Her voice was lower now, almost a whisper. The lights flickered. The air grew heavier. I picked up the burger with trembling hands. The moment I brought it closer, the smell intensified. Rotting flesh, old blood. I gagged. The waitress's smile widened. "Just one bite." I dropped it onto the plate, my heart pounding. "I think I'll just take my check." The diner fell silent. The jukebox died. The waitress's eyes darkened. "That's not how this works." I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't move. My limbs felt like lead. The man at the counter turned slowly. His face was gray, sunken. His lips pulled back to reveal blackened teeth. The woman by the window tilted her head, her neck bending too far. The elderly couple's whispers turned to choking sounds. My blood ran cold. I was not supposed to be here. I forced my body to move, gripping the edge of the table and stumbling to my feet. My legs felt sluggish, as if something was pulling me down. The waitress's expression never changed, but her voice was different now. Hollow. Hungry. You can't leave, sugar. Not until you finish your meal. I bolted for the door. A terrible wailing filled the diner, a sound of pure despair and rage. The lights flickered violently. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. I grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. I turned. The patrons were no longer human. Their skin peeled away in strips. Empty eye sockets leaked black fluid. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. They reached for me with clawed fingers, their voices overlapping in a sickening, distorted chorus. Stay with us. I slammed my shoulder against the door. Again. With one final push, it burst open. I fell onto the pavement, gasping. The cold night air hit me like a slap. I scrambled to my feet, running to my car without looking back. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life and I peeled out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, the diner stood there, dark, empty, like it had never been open. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, but eventually exhaustion won. When I woke up the following evening, my stomach growled. I got up, walked into my kitchen, and reached for something to eat. And then I froze. Sitting on my counter, neatly wrapped in old-fashioned paper, was a takeout box. Stamped across the top, in red, blocky letters, Mel's Diner. Thank you for dining with us. I never opened it. I never went back. But the hunger never went away. I don't know why I stopped at that diner. I was exhausted, sure. I had been driving for hours on that lonely stretch of highway, nothing but the hum of my tires and the occasional road sign to keep me company. But something about Mel's Diner made me uneasy from the moment I saw its flickering neon sign through the thick fog rolling across the road. Open 24 hours, always serving. It was strange because I had taken this highway before, and I had never seen the diner. I should have kept driving, but hunger gnawed at my stomach, and fatigue blurred my vision. So I pulled into the empty parking lot, my headlights cutting through the mist. The diner sat in eerie stillness, its large windows glowing with an unnatural yellow light. The neon buzzed faintly, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw the letters flicker into something else. Something I couldn't quite read. I shook it off and stepped inside. A bell above the door jingled, but the sound was muted, like it had been swallowed by thick air. The place was straight out of the 1950s. Checkered floors, red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner playing some old tune I couldn't place. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, but beneath it was something stale, something that made the back of my throat itch. Only a handful of people were inside. A man in a suit sat at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee without drinking it. A young woman in a polka-dot dress sat in a booth, her hands folded neatly on the table. An elderly couple whispered to each other in a language I couldn't understand. Something about them felt wrong. And then there was the waitress. She stood behind the counter, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her blonde curls were stiff, like they had been set in place for too long. Her pale blue uniform was spotless. Too spotless. She smiled. It was too wide, too perfect. "Welcome to Mel's," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Take a seat anywhere, sugar." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet carried me to a booth near the window, my reflection in the glass looking paler than it should. The waitress was suddenly beside me, too fast, too quiet. "You look hungry," she cooed, flipping open a small notepad. "Yeah." I glanced at the menu, frowning. There were no prices, just items like meatloaf surprise and endless roast. "I'll just take a burger and coffee." "Good choice," she said, and I swore her grin stretched just a little too far. As she walked back to the kitchen, I turned my attention to the other patrons. None of them had moved. The man in the suit was still stirring his coffee. The woman in the polka-dot dress still had her hands folded, staring blankly ahead. The elderly couple whispered in hushed, hurried tones, their fingers twitching against the table. The jukebox crackled, the old tune skipping, like a broken record. I shifted uncomfortably. My gut twisted. Something was seriously wrong here. Then the smell hit me. Rot. It was faint, hidden beneath the scent of frying grease. But it was there. Old, decayed meat. Something long past its expiration date. The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress returned with my food. A burger, fries, coffee. At first glance, it looked normal, but the patty was too red, glistening in a way that made my stomach turn. The fries were limp, soaked in something dark. The coffee was thick, too thick. The waitress watched me expectantly. I hesitated, and that's when I saw it. The people in the diner were no longer people. The man in the suit had no eyes, just gaping black sockets that wept something dark. The woman's polka dot dress was stained, her mouth sewn shut with brittle, yellowed thread. The elderly couple's hands were too thin, their skin hanging off their bones like loose fabric. I choked on my breath, my hands shaking as I pushed away from the table. The waitress was still smiling. "You should eat sugar," she said, tilting her head. I pushed the plate away. Her smile faltered. The lights flickered. The air grew thick, pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. "You need to eat," she repeated, her voice sharper now. Behind her, the kitchen door swung open again. But there was no kitchen, only blackness, a void, a gaping, endless maw of nothingness, pulsing like something alive. I shot to my feet. The other patrons, the dead patrons, turned their hollow faces toward me. Their lips parted in unison, voices layering on top of each other. A sickening chorus of hunger. "Stay, stay, stay." My heart pounded. I turned and ran. The waitress lunged, her fingers too long, too sharp, but I dodged, shoving past the man at the counter. His coffee spilled, but it wasn't coffee. It was thick, black sludge that smelled of death. I reached the door, locked. Behind me, the dead were moving now, crawling toward me, their mouths stretching too wide, their skin sloughing off in wet chunks. I slammed against the door. Again. The neon sign outside flickered, and I saw the letters change. Open forever. Serving the lost. A scream tore from my throat as the door gave way and I stumbled outside, onto a highway that was completely empty. No diner, no neon sign, just the road, stretching endlessly into the fog. I staggered to my car, my breath ragged, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I sped down the highway, refusing to check my rearview mirror, refusing to acknowledge the shadows that seemed to chase me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, but hunger gnawed at my stomach, relentless, insatiable. And then I saw it, a takeout box, sitting on my kitchen counter, neatly wrapped in old-fashioned paper, stamped with red, blocky letters. Mel's Diner, thank you for dining with US. Come back soon. My stomach growled, and for the first time I knew what real hunger was. I never went back, but I don't think that matters, because one day I know Mel's will find me again. I had been driving for hours. The storm had knocked out my GPS signal, and the back roads all looked the same, winding, empty, swallowed by endless darkness. My fuel gauge was dipping close to empty, and my stomach twisted with hunger. That's when I saw the neon sign through the rain-smeared windshield. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. It was strange. I had driven this route before and never seen a diner here. But desperation won over suspicion. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching over loose gravel. The diner was old-fashioned, with checkered floors visible through large foggy windows. A warm, yellow glow seeped out into the night, promising comfort. Something about it felt wrong. I shook off the feeling and stepped inside. A bell jingled above the door, but the sound was dull, like it had been swallowed by thick air. The place was mostly empty. A few patrons sat in booths unmoving. A woman in a red dress stared out the window, her expression blank. An elderly man hunched over a cup of coffee, his hands motionless. A young boy sat alone, his small fingers drumming on the table in an eerie, rhythmic pattern. None of them looked up when I entered. Then I saw the waitress. She stood behind the counter, smiling too wide. Her uniform was pristine, her hair stiff with unnatural curls. "Welcome to Mel's," she said, voice syrupy sweet. "Take a seat anywhere." Sugar. I hesitated. Something about her eyes made my skin crawl. Too dark, too deep. But I slid into a booth, my reflection in the window staring back at me, distorted by the rain. The waitress glided over, not walked. "You must be starving," she cooed, flipping open a notepad. I swallowed. "Yeah, just a burger and coffee." Her smile widened. "Good choice." She disappeared into the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. I glanced around again. None of the other patrons had moved. The jukebox in the corner crackled to life. A warped version of Dream, a Little Dream of Me played, the melody dragging unnaturally slow. My gut twisted. Then I smelled it. Beneath the scent of coffee and grease, there was something rotting. The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress returned. Plate was set in front of me. A burger, fries, coffee. It looked off. The patty was too raw, the fries limp, soaked in something dark. The coffee was thick, almost sludge. "You should eat," the waitress said, voice softer now. I forced a weak chuckle. I think I'll just have the coffee." Her smile faltered. The air around me grew thick. "You should eat," she repeated. I glanced at the other diners. They were all staring at me now, silent, unblinking, waiting. I reached for the coffee with trembling hands. It was too warm, too heavy, the scent making my stomach lurch. I set it down. "I think I'll just get the check," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The waitress's eyes darkened. The lights flickered. The jukebox skipped, repeating the same warped verse over and over. "You need to eat," she hissed. A chill shot down my spine. I stood abruptly. The elderly man's head snapped toward me, his neck cracking at an unnatural angle. The woman in red smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. The young boy laughed, a hollow, guttural sound. The waitress grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. "You can't leave," she said. I yanked away. "The hell I can't." I bolted for the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, the entire diner screamed. Not the sound of people, but something inhuman, a wailing chorus of despair and rage. The walls shuddered. The floor tilted beneath me. The lights exploded, plunging everything into darkness. Hands grabbed at me, nails slicing into my skin. The air was thick with the scent of decay. I shoved forward. The door was locked. Behind me, something gurgled. "Stay," the waitress whispered, her voice right against my ear. "You belong here now." My heart pounded. I slammed against the door again. With a final, desperate shove, it burst open. I stumbled onto the highway, into silence. I spun around. The diner was gone. Only empty roads stretched behind me. No sign of the neon glow. No building. Just darkness. I staggered to my car, my breath ragged, my hands trembling. I sped away, never looking back. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, but hunger gnawed at my stomach. Then, 2 nights later, I saw it. A takeout box, sitting on my kitchen counter, wrapped neatly in old-fashioned paper, stamped with red, blocky letters. "Mel's Diner, thank you for dining with US. Come back soon." I never went back, but I don't think that matters, because one day I know Mel's will find me again. I should have kept driving. The rain had been relentless for hours, hammering against my windshield as I navigated the winding highway. My gas tank was running dangerously low, and I hadn't seen another car in miles. When I finally spotted the glowing neon sign through the downpour, it felt like a miracle. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, my tires kicking up water and mud. The building looked like something out of a postcard from the 1950s. Chrome accents, red vinyl booths, checkered floors. The neon buzzed and flickered, its light reflecting off the wet pavement. but something about it made my skin crawl. I shook off the unease. It was late. I was tired. That was all. The moment I stepped inside, a bell above the door jingled, but the sound was off, muffled, like it was coming from somewhere far away. The place was eerily silent, except for the faint crackle of a jukebox in the corner, playing an old tune I couldn't quite place. Only a handful of customers were inside. A man in a dark suit sat at the counter, stirring his coffee without drinking it. A woman in a red dress stared blankly ahead, her expression frozen. An elderly couple sat in the far booth, whispering to each other in a language I didn't recognize. None of them looked up when I entered. Then I saw the waitress. She stood behind the counter, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her uniform was immaculate, her blonde curls stiff and unmoving. She smiled, too wide, too perfect. "Welcome to Mel's," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Take a seat anywhere." Sugar. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn around, to get back in my car and leave. But my stomach growled, and exhaustion weighed heavy on my limbs. I slid into a booth near the window, watching as rain cascaded down the glass in thick rivulets. My reflection looked paler than it should. The waitress appeared beside me, too fast, too quiet. "You must be hungry," she said, flipping open a small notepad. "Yeah, just a burger and coffee." "Good choice," she said, her grin never faltering. She didn't write anything down. She disappeared into the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. That's when I noticed it. The other customers hadn't moved. The man in the suit was still stirring his coffee, the spoon clinking against porcelain in a steady, mechanical rhythm. The woman in the red dress hadn't blinked once. The elderly couple's whispering had stopped, but their lips were still moving. The jukebox crackled again, skipping over the same few notes, distorting the song into something unnatural. I shifted uncomfortably. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. Then the smell hit me. Rot. It was faint, hidden beneath the scent of frying grease, but it was there. Something old, something dead. The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress returned. She placed the plate in front of me. A burger, fries, coffee. At first glance, it looked normal, but the patty was too red, glistening in a way that made my stomach turn. The fries were limp, soaked in something dark. The coffee was thick, almost sludge-like. The waitress stood there, watching, waiting. "You should eat," she said. I hesitated, my gut twisting. "I'm not really that hungry." Her smile faltered. The lights flickered. "You should eat," she repeated, her voice sharper now. I pushed the plate away. The coffee rippled, though I hadn't touched it. I looked around. The other patrons had turned toward me. Their faces were wrong now. The man at the counter had no eyes, just empty sockets weeping black sludge. The woman's red dress was stained with something dark, her mouth sewn shut with brittle, yellowed thread. The elderly couple's hands were too thin, their skin hanging off their bones like loose fabric. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up too fast, my chair screeching against the floor. The waitress didn't move. "You can't leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The lights buzzed violently. The jukebox skipped and slowed, the warped song dragging like something dying. "You can't leave," the dead whispered in unison. I bolted. The moment my hand touched the door, the room shifted. The walls stretched, the ceiling warped, the diner growing longer, endless, inescapable. The door handle burned cold beneath my fingers. I turned back. The dead were closer now, their mouths stretching open, their voices layering on top of each other. A sickening, echoing chorus of hunger. "Stay, stay, stay." I threw my weight against the door. It didn't budge. Something gurgled behind me. "You need to eat," the waitress whispered. I slammed against the door. Again. The neon sign outside flickered, the letters rearranging themselves. "Open forever. Serving the lost." I screamed as the door gave way, and I tumbled onto the highway, into nothingness. No rain, no neon glow, just the road, stretching endlessly into the fog. I staggered to my car, my breath ragged. my hands trembling so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I drove for hours until the sun finally rose, but I never found that stretch of highway again. I tried. I drove up and down the same roads, searching, desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. The diner wasn't there. It had never been there. Or maybe it was only there when it wanted to be. Then, a few nights later, I found it. A takeout box, sitting on my kitchen counter, neatly wrapped in old-fashioned paper, stamped with red, blocky letters. Mel's Diner, thank you for dining with us. Come back soon. My stomach growled, and for the first time I felt something deep inside me change. I never went back, but I don't think that matters, because one day I know Mel's will find me again.